Es la primera vez en casi 50 años que Naciones Unidas convoca un evento global de reflexión sobre la situación en temas de agua, saneamiento, ecosistemas de agua, etc. Ya no, en esta ocasión no es el sector privado el que, aprovechando la debilidad institucional que padecemos en Naciones Unidas respecto a los temas de agua y saneamiento, aprovechando esa debilidad, como bien sabéis todos, ha sido el sector privado el que ha organizado todos los eventos y organizaciones bajo protocolos y aspecto, apariencia de ser Naciones Unidas, pero en realidad esos foros mundiales del agua, ese Consejo Mundial del Agua, al final son eventos o instituciones organizadas y controladas por el sector privado. Yo suelo decir, esta conferencia es como, imaginemos que Naciones Unidas no existiera la Organización Mundial de la Salud y que cada 2 o 3 años fuera el lobby privado farmacéutico quien convocara a nivel mundial para reflexionar en torno a qué políticas deberíamos de desarrollar para cuidar la salud pública. Y que en esta ocasión, tras la COVID, fuera Naciones Unidas por primera vez quien convocara el evento. Se generaría una expectación mundial enorme, una expectativa muy grande. Pues bien, ese es el desafío que tenemos delante de nosotros con esta conferencia por primera vez en casi 50 años convocada por Naciones Unidas. Dicho esto, también debo decir que, y por tanto, digo, yo desde el principio siempre insistí que esta opción no era la adecuada para organizar una conferencia alternativa, sino que era un momento en donde todos los movimientos sociales, las instituciones públicas que están peleando, luchando también por los derechos humanos, y en particular ante los derechos humanos al agua potable, al saneamiento, los defensores y defensoras de los ríos y de los ecosistemas, lo que teníamos era que demandar de Naciones Unidas que esta conferencia sea un gran espacio de encuentro, de debate, de escucha del sistema de Naciones Unidas respecto a lo que tienen que decir los que generalmente no tienen voz, no tienen representación. Vamos a decir, los titulares de derechos, los right holders, que generalmente en la defensa, en la exigencia de sus derechos humanos, a menudo son criminalizados incluso y perseguidos. Dicho esto, que es en la dinámica en la que estamos, debo advertir que Naciones Unidas, sin embargo, no es un espacio ideal, todos lo sabemos. Es el espacio que han creado los gobiernos, bajo protocolos y dinámicas muy pesadas, muy burocráticas, en la que la prioridad es la representación de los gobiernos y en donde también los grandes actores privados, los grandes intereses, los stakeholders, los que tienen intereses en el agua, también tienen palancas importantes de poder. Luego, por tanto, no pretendo, lo que advierto es, no esperemos un lugar idílico, maravilloso, en donde realmente eso que sería necesario, ese gran espacio de encuentro, de debate, de escucha, sea lo que nos encontremos. Desgraciadamente no es así, no será así. De entrada, fijaros, apenas en agosto pasado, hace poco tiempo, en agosto pasado, los organizadores que están delegados por la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas en los gobiernos de Holanda y allí, ni siquiera citan el término derechos humanos. No citaban siquiera el término pueblos indígenas. Era una concepción simplemente de hablar del agua como un elemento importante en gran medida y sobre todo para la economía, para el desarrollo. Es a partir de que empezamos a presionar, por un lado, pueblos indígenas, movimientos sociales y yo mismo como relator, los propios organizadores se dan cuenta que tienen que cambiar cosas, que tienen que dar entrada a movimientos sociales. Empiezan a oír hablar de que, aunque ya no fuera posible que el conjunto de la conferencia estuviera presidida por un enfoque de derechos humanos, había que dar entrada a los derechos humanos, en este caso agua potable y saneamiento. Y eso ha ido cambiando y sigue todavía en un proceso de evolución, aunque ya en gran medida las cuestiones están en gran medida decididas, ¿no? Yo creo que fue importante el Foro Social del Agua en el mes de noviembre, bajo la presidencia, bajo la encomienda realizada a los gobiernos de Bolivia y de España, ese Foro Social del Agua que se organizó, que organizamos en Ginebra, preparando la Conferencia Mundial del Agua, fue importante, porque ahí sí que conseguimos introducir y hacerlo presidir con un enfoque de derechos humanos. Y conseguimos también que los organizadores de Nueva York participaran en el evento y se dieran cuenta de lo que queríamos decir cuando hablábamos de esa prioridad en torno al agua como derecho humano, al agua potable y derecho humano al saneamiento. Con esto, en definitiva, vengo a deciros, creo que será importante en lo que queda todavía de tiempo de organización. Estamos intentando, tanto desde pueblos indígenas que tienen ya una buena posición dentro de la organización del evento, como por parte de la relatoría y también de otros movimientos, fundamentalmente ONGs, que tienen también una práctica, tienen una cierta capacidad de presión interna. Parte de todos nosotros todavía tenemos que buscar abrir el máximo de espacio posible, tanto en los plenarios oficiales como en los special events y en los side events. Pero quiero insistiros, y con esto remato lo fundamental de lo que quería deciros, que también va a ser más importante incluso hacer la propia agenda de los movimientos sociales. No es mi función como relator decir lo que deben hacer los movimientos sociales, pero yo estoy insistiendo en una cuestión dentro de Naciones Unidas. Hay un protocolo, un mensaje ya formado en donde Naciones Unidas siempre habla del diálogo con los stakeholders. Aquí yo he aprendido de los pueblos indígenas. Cuando estamos en reuniones y hay representantes indígenas y están en el diálogo con los stakeholders, los indígenas levantan la mano y preguntan, disculpen, señores organizadores, ¿estamos invitados? Y entonces desde la mesa preguntan, ¿quiénes son ustedes? Bueno, pues somos los representantes del pueblo indígena, el que sea, ¿no? No, claro, ustedes son stakeholders, están invitados. No, señor. No somos stakeholders. Somos right holders. Y pedimos, ¿estamos invitados, sí o no? Yo creo que es muy importante romper el mito del stakeholders, que cuando lo hacemos en castellano, en español, tiene un mensaje también muy clarificador. Cuando se habla de stakeholders, se dice en español intereses en el agua, interesados en el agua. Es decir, sectores que tienen interés o intereses que pueden ser legítimos o no tanto en el tema del agua. Pero al final el problema es que ¿con quién dialoga Naciones Unidas? Dialoga con los que tienen dinero y capacidad de hacer acción de lobby en Ginebra, acción de lobby en Nueva York, que tienen dinero para viajar, para estar en esas ciudades tan caras. Y entonces yo cuando pregunto en Naciones Unidas, ¿tienen ustedes facilidad para hablar con los representantes del lobby privado, con Aquafed? ¿Tienen dificultades para hablar con los stakeholders que representan al lobby hidroeléctrico? ¿Tienen ustedes problemas para hablar con el lobby que representa a los intereses del agronegocio internacional? Me dicen, no hay ningún problema. Están siempre con nosotros, tienen un lobby permanente instalado dentro de Naciones Unidas. Y cuando les pregunto, ¿y tienen ustedes relación con acueductos comunitarios de América Latina? 100 millones de personas empobrecidas en el medio rural Y dice, no, con esos no tenemos relación. Ahí está el problema. Esa es la gran brecha que está por cubrir. El diálogo con los water defenders, con los defensores y defensoras del agua en su calidad de right holders, de titulares del agua. Por eso yo quiero deciros, es muy importante que esta conferencia, en lo que podamos visibilizar, exijamos, demandemos un espacio de diálogo y de trabajo conjunto, de colaboración entre el sistema de Naciones Unidas y los right holders, los defensores y defensoras del agua, los water defenders, y abrir ese espacio, esa nomenclatura, ¿no? Claramente. Yo estoy animando en esa dirección y por eso yo, y acabo aquí, es muy importante también qué estrategia toman los movimientos para, de manera autónoma, conseguir que esa conferencia de Naciones Unidas sea una caja de resonancia de las demandas, de las necesidades de los right holders, de los water defenders. Yo creo que tendremos que buscar espacio dentro de los espacios oficiales de la conferencia, pero también tener una estrategia, una agenda específica en los movimientos sociales lo más visible posible para demandar, exigir ese espacio de diálogo, ese compromiso de una agenda de diálogo y trabajo entre el sistema de Naciones Unidas y los water defenders en su calidad de right holders. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Dr. Arrojo, for providing that information about the conference and its goals and intentions and the potential for the opening of space for social movements. I especially appreciate the distinction between stakeholders and rights holders, which is a critical point for these discussions. Next, I am honored to introduce our second speaker, Dario Mejía Montalvo. He belongs to the indigenous Zenu peoples of San Andrés de Sotavento. He is a political scientist from the National University of Colombia with a degree in management of development conferred by the University of the Autonomous Regions of the Nicaraguan Caribbean Coast. He is also a member of the National Commission for Labor and Coordination of Education of the Indigenous Peoples of Colombia. He is the leader in the National Indigenous Organization of Colombia. So thank you for joining us today. Mr. Mejía, would you please provide us with a perspective on the expectations of Indigenous peoples movements for the UN Water Conference and help us understand how the broader water justice movement can join with the Indigenous peoples?
Buenos días. Muchas gracias por esta invitación. Yo agradezco mucho las palabras de presentación y la intervención de nuestro amigo Pedro Arrojo, a quien saludo de manera muy especial. Siempre muy activo en estas pretensiones colectivas como pueblos y como sociedades. Quiero precisar, en este momento me desempeño como presidente del Foro Permanente de las Naciones Unidas para Cuestiones Indígenas, que es uno de los mecanismos especiales que existen en este momento en el sistema, cuya tarea nuestra es asesorar y recomendar a los gobiernos y a las agencias de la ONU la manera de implementar adecuadamente los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en todo el mundo. Yo quiero, para entender un poco de lo que están hablando los pueblos indígenas, utilizar una forma pedagógica en este momento para entender de lo que estamos hablando. Y lo primero es decir que todas las sociedades en el mundo tienen una forma de pensamiento específica. Y la sociedad que hoy día consideramos, podemos decir, occidental, que tiene un origen histórico concreto, de la conjugación de un mito de origen, donde, según este mito de origen, el hombre fue creado a imagen y semejanza de un ser supremo, de Dios, y que este ser supremo le otorgó a los seres humanos el derecho de administrar y cuidar, y aprovechar a la naturaleza. Este es el mito de origen. Algunos dicen no es un mito, es una historia sagrada. Pero en realidad es una cosmovisión que se ha venido imponiendo en distintas formas, a sangre y fuego, a través de las religiones en todo el mundo, y que luego se ha convertido en las bases centrales del mercado y del capitalismo. Pero en realidad esto es una cosmovisión. Como existen miles de cosmovisiones en cada uno de los pueblos que existen en el mundo, tanto en los pueblos indígenas como en otros pueblos, existen sus propias cosmovisiones. Y estas cosmovisiones son las que establecen los sistemas de valores sobre los cuales andamos y nos relacionamos con la naturaleza y con los demás seres humanos. Aclarado esto, entonces podemos decir que para la mayoría de los pueblos indígenas, esta creación del mundo no está por un ente abstracto, sino que para la mayoría de los pueblos indígenas, el origen del mundo está dado por algo tangible, algo material, algo concreto. Por ejemplo, por el agua, o por una montaña, o por el mar, o por los ríos, o por una planta. Entonces el origen del mundo no está dado en la abstracción, sino en lo concreto y cotidiano. Y en segundo lugar, para la mayoría de los pueblos indígenas, la naturaleza no es un objeto, ni es un recurso de propiedad de los seres humanos, sino al contrario. Es la naturaleza la que tiene derechos, la que define el orden, la que define los valores, y los seres humanos hacen parte de esta dinámica de la naturaleza. Se hace una comprensión holística, donde la madre tierra o el agua es el centro de las necesidades y son quienes tienen derechos. Y los seres humanos dependemos de ella. Es una cosmovisión distinta. Es una cosmovisión en la cual el agua, en este caso, no es un recurso, ni es un derecho de los humanos, sino que los seres humanos somos una consecuencia. Es decir, el agua es la madre. El agua tiene un sentido práctico, pero también tiene un sentido espiritual, tiene un valor espiritual. Entonces, esta discusión es mucho más profunda que la discusión entre el mercado del agua y los derechos humanos y los bienes y servicios que genera el acceso al agua. Es mucho más profunda. Pero contribuir a la discusión sobre los derechos humanos es importante, y los pueblos indígenas están dispuestos a contribuir en esa discusión, sin olvidar que para los pueblos indígenas el agua no es un recurso, no es solo un derecho humano, es una fuente de vida que es diferente. Dicho esto, esta es la discusión que se está dando en este momento al interior de los pueblos indígenas y que quieren llevar a la discusión. Ahora, esta discusión no tiene un sentido folclórico, ni declarativo, ni romanticismo. Esta perspectiva que queremos compartir y que los pueblos indígenas llevan desde hace miles de años, también tiene un sentido práctico, tiene un sentido de contribuciones. Eso se demuestra porque en gran parte de los territorios indígenas en este momento son el resultado de 5 siglos de expropiación, son el resultado de desplazamientos históricos, porque muchos de los pueblos indígenas con estas cosmovisiones vivían en los lugares más productivos hace 5 siglos atrás, con grandes ciudades, con grandes sistemas de administración del agua. Tenemos evidencias históricas de que existen construcciones hidráulicas grandes en territorios indígenas en todo el mundo. Es decir, las ciudades de los pueblos indígenas, sus centros urbanos, estaban diseñados para una convivencia con el agua, para una convivencia con los recursos naturales. Y estas fueron destruidas y los pueblos indígenas desplazados a territorios considerados inhóspitos, considerados habitables solo por fieras. Y es ahí donde, a partir de estas cosmovisiones, han conservado la diversidad del planeta. Hoy día, entonces, no se puede hablar de lucha contra el cambio climático si no se tiene en cuenta estas formas de conocimiento y esos sistemas de valores que han permitido conservar y que se convierten en este momento en verdaderas esponjas de absorción de los principales contaminantes del planeta, los gases de efecto de invernadero, que son los que están provocando la aceleración de los ciclos climáticos, que no es otra cosa que la alteración de los ciclos del agua de la naturaleza. Nosotros no podemos concebir que una medida de lucha contra el cambio climático se concentre, por ejemplo, solo en el cuidado de los bosques y no al mismo tiempo en el cuidado de los nevados, o en el cuidado de los desiertos, o en el cuidado del mar, porque finalmente lo que suceda en un lugar afecta a otro lugar. Lo que suceda en los polos afecta a las costas y afecta a los ríos. Lo que suceda en los ríos afecta a los humedales. Lo que suceda en los nevados con la minería y con la extracción afecta a la selva y ayuda a mitigar o a acelerar los incendios forestales en las selvas y en otros lugares. Entonces, el planeta mismo es una vida en sí misma, es un sistema integral que, visto desde esta manera, no podemos nosotros simplemente asumir que el agua es solo un recurso para acceder y tomar y sobrevivir como especie, porque no vamos a lograr ningún resultado si mantenemos esta perspectiva. Hay que asumir el agua de manera integral, y las discusiones que se deben dar en Naciones Unidas deberían tener un enfoque integral, porque finalmente esta perspectiva no es solo para los pueblos indígenas. Esta forma de asumir la discusión no afecta ni va a favorecer solamente a los pueblos indígenas, sino que es una contribución para la humanidad, porque la humanidad necesita entender que el agua no se produce en la llave del grifo, ni se produce allí, sino que el agua tiene todo un ciclo vital y que la contaminación está afectando gran parte de los ciclos vitales, y que lo que suceda con el agua en las ciudades va a afectar en el campo, va a afectar a las especies, va a afectar a las mariposas, va a afectar a las abejas. Y lo que suceda con las abejas va a suceder con la especie humana. Si se extinguen unas, también se extinguirán las otras. De manera que Esta es la perspectiva que nos que los pueblos indígenas están trayendo a esta conferencia y que están invitando al resto de la sociedad a que compartan y que se haga bloque común para incidir ante los gobiernos, porque no se trata solo de una política de administración de un recurso, sino fundamentalmente de una medida para ayudar en el control de las consecuencias de la misma acción humana sobre el planeta. Yo quería compartir esas ideas generales con ustedes y agradecerles la invitación y invitarlos a que se siga manteniendo un contacto permanente entre las distintas expresiones de los movimientos sociales y que sea un aprendizaje continuo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Mr. Mejía, for joining us today. And thank you for bringing to this conversation the rights of nature and the spiritual value of water to help us contextualize water beyond water as a service and water as a right for humans, why we need to view water in a more comprehensive way. And I want to extend special appreciation to our first two speakers for providing an overview of the conference and grounding us with the necessary background for our panel discussion. We have 5 wonderful panelists who I will introduce shortly. As a reminder, if you have a question for our panelists or speakers today, please put it in the Q&A box and we will have time at the end for some audience questions. First, I'm pleased to introduce our first panelist, Meera Karunananthan. Meera is a lecturer in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Carleton University and the chair of the Blue Planet Project, a water justice organization supporting frontline struggles against water privatization around the world. She is also a board member at Peace Brigades International Canada, which is part of a global movement of activists seeking justice and peace and standing in solidarity with threatened human rights defenders around the world. Meera, would you discuss the water justice movement and its relationship with the United Nations generally, and then provide some background about the problems with public participation at the forthcoming conference in particular, and help the audience understand why the People's Water Forum launched Blue February?
Thank you, Mary. Thanks, everyone. I think that was an amazing introduction by Pedro and Dario. So I'll keep it brief and give our other panelists a chance to talk as well. The water justice movement and what is particular about water in relation to international struggles is that water is very much a local struggle. So unlike climate change and greenhouse gases, where the impacts are felt internationally or standards are set internationally, water is very much about what is happening locally. So water pollution is the impacts are felt locally. Even if you're talking about workers' rights, we're talking about local struggles. And the water justice movement therefore emerged 20 years ago or more, or what we refer to as the global water justice movement, emerged out of local struggles that had been going on for many decades. But a little over 20 years ago, when groups locally were fighting privatization, and we were starting to see similar struggles, groups were starting to see some similar struggles around the world, an effort was made for, through dialogue between different groups, we started building an international movement. And the target at the time became these big international gatherings called the World Water Forums, where corporations were gathering to talk about water policy. And all of these local groups and organizations, some working at the national level, started realizing that we needed to understand what was happening globally, that we needed to look at how corporations were starting to influence our governments on water policies, and that would have an impact at the local level. And so we became a global movement initially in relation to the struggle against global meetings of corporations gathering with our governments. And so it began with the World Water Forum, and then evolved to other spaces. But what happened over time, what began then as a protest against these World Water Forums, started to evolve into its own entity, its own thing, right? And so we started creating alternative water forums, and we started realizing that these alternative water forums were actually very meaningful and productive spaces for us to develop our own strategies, for us to replicate our victories, for us to learn from each other and support each other to develop joint actions. And so the Alternative Water Forum then eventually, decades later, has now evolved into what we're calling the People's Water Forum. We've decided we're no longer the alternative. We shouldn't think of ourselves as the alternatives. We shouldn't think of ourselves as marginal, but that we represent the voices of impacted people. And so we started calling ourselves the People's Water Forum. We just launched a website, so you should all check it out, all of the groups who are in attendance today, and look at our website. We've been organizing then in relation to this UN water meeting. So in terms of the UN then, what has been, so we've decided, initially we began through our international target, or our international campaign. Our first international campaign was the campaign to have water recognized as a human right at the UN. And this was very much a victory of social movements who had been pushing for it for many, many years. And in 2010, the UN formally recognized the human rights to water and sanitation. And since then, however, we've also seen the limitations of the human right to water and sanitation. Dario talked about cosmovisions, and most certainly we are dealing right now with a cosmovision of capitalism that is dominating all of our lives and shaping our relationships to water. But we also would say, most of us, that human rights is also limited cosmovision, right? That it has been an important and strategic tool for us in our struggles, in our fights against privatization, in our fights against water pollution or the loss of control at the local level over water. But at the same time, human rights, our cosmovisions collectively are much, much broader. And human rights, because human rights deals with things like access to water, and it's within a very limited framework, whereas our struggles have been around control over water and developing systems for more democratic relationships and democratic decision-making around water. And so we have a much broader vision, and that is not encapsulated by the human right. However, it's been very important for us to fight for that space at the UN, because, as Pedro has said, even the space for human rights has been limited. And in international law, then human rights are not binding in international law, whereas trade agreements are binding. We've seen how loan conditionalities, how the World Bank and the conditions it imposes around loans, those are binding, but human rights are less so. And so, and now with the SDG process, the problem has also been that the World Bank, the international financial institutions, not just corporations, it's actually been a lot more. The international financial institutions have dominated the process of how we're going to ensure universal access to everyone, universal access to water and sanitation. And so we've converged around global struggles, but what I will say is that our power at the international level, our capacity at the international level, for many of the reasons that Pedro has, outlined earlier, our power is limited at the international level. However, what we've learned over time is us coming together, that we can build wonderful things together. And so converging, discussing, refining our collective narratives, that's been really important, but also monitoring what happens at the international level, monitoring what decisions are being made, who is influencing these decisions, and bringing that information, that knowledge back to the local level. That's been very important. So we're not necessarily going to fight the World Bank or corporations at the UN. And I would say that's also true for the UN Water Conference. So what's been disappointing is that the UN Water Conference isn't very different from the World Water Forum. It's the same cosmovision. It's the same ideology that's being promoted at the UN Water Conference. However, what we learn from there, we will bring back to our communities, and we will continue to use our collective networks to fight these corporations and these international financial institutions in our own communities, where we are much more powerful. Thank you.
Thank you, Meera, for such a wonderful overview of the decades of struggles and growth and changes within the water justice movements. So now to tell us more about the Blue February events, I'm pleased to introduce Marcela Olivera. Marcela works at the Blue Planet Project and is a water commons organizer based in Cochabamba, Bolivia. Since 2004, she has been developing and consolidating an inter-American community network on water justice called Red Vida. She sits on the coordinating committee of the Platform for Public and Community Partnerships of the Americas. Marcela, can you provide an overview of the collective actions of the global water justice movement leading up to and during the conference? Please tell us what the goals are, what is on the horizon, and how can people participate in these actions?
Thank you, Mary. I'm gonna speak in Spanish because that's my language. Apenas supimos de la organización de esta conferencia, gracias a Pedro, inmediatamente empezamos a organizarnos. En el año pasado, a fines del año pasado, realizamos un llamamiento y alertamos a las organizaciones que trabajan por la justicia del agua de la realización de esta conferencia. Este llamamiento primero explicaba la importancia de este evento y por qué nos tenía que afectar, por qué nos afectaba a nosotros, ¿no? En este llamamiento nosotros, después de un proceso de reflexión sobre este espacio, uno de los puntos de este llamado decía que exigíamos que la agenda de las Naciones Unidas retome la discusión del agua como sustancia de la vida y bien común, y que no debe ser objeto nunca de mercantilización, comercialización y financiarización. Esto un poco me parece que va con lo que alineado con lo que acabamos de escuchar también, con esta visión tan rica que nos ha traído Dario sobre la mesa, pero también con lo que Pedro nos decía, ¿no? Es mezclar estas visiones a veces que hemos olvidado de nuestras raíces culturales, pero también asentados en una coyuntura, en una realidad también presente y actual. Y este es un llamado de nuestros compañeros del Brasil. Ellos propusieron la organización de una serie de eventos que vayan creando una especie de momento hacia lo que venía con la conferencia en las Naciones Unidas. De ellos, de los compañeros de Brasil, de Ondas particularmente, que es un observatorio del agua y el saneamiento, que se ha creado, de hecho, después de uno de los foros alternativos del agua. Los compañeros decían, vamos a organizarnos, vamos a hacer una serie de acciones para hablar sobre esto que está pasando, para retomar la discusión, para que esta agenda no se quede en manos de unos pocos, pero que se socialice entre los movimientos que trabajan por la justicia del agua. Entonces de ahí surgió la idea de lo que se ha llamado ahora el Febrero Azul. Este webinario es parte de estas acciones que se han estado organizando. Hay algunas acciones que se están haciendo a nivel virtual. Esta es una de ellas. Como les digo, van a haber otros 2 webinarios más. De hecho, hubo un webinario a principios de mes también organizado por los compañeros de África. La otra son una serie de acciones locales que se han venido, de hecho, ya realizando. En Serbia, por ejemplo, los compañeros han estado movilizados. En el Brasil, en alianza con los trabajadores que están peleando la privatización no solo del agua, pero también de otros servicios. Se han organizado acciones en la Bolsa de Valores. Creemos que es importante alertar a todos los que están trabajando el tema del agua sobre estas nuevas formas de privatización que están sucediendo. Es necesario democratizar esta discusión porque si no se queda en algo abstracto que no logramos entender. Entonces han habido estas acciones regionales, locales, pero también están habiendo estas acciones en línea más de conexiones internacionales, ¿no? Hemos también, nos hemos registrado oficialmente en lo que está en la conferencia de Nueva York y estamos también planeando realizar algunos eventos paralelos allá. Entonces son todas estas formas, estas dimensiones que han tomado las acciones y otra vez la idea es empezar a democratizar la discusión, empezar a organizarnos nuevamente, empezar a exigir y demandar que se abra este diálogo también en las Naciones Unidas. Si bien podemos crear espacios entre nosotros donde conversamos entre nosotros, es necesario también ir golpeando las puertas de estas organizaciones que históricamente nos han excluido de estas discusiones, ¿no? Entonces no nos vamos a cansar de seguir organizándonos, de seguir empujando las puertas, golpeando las puertas de estas conferencias, de seguir poniendo nuestras voces ahí, pero al mismo tiempo de crear espacios donde nosotros podamos discutir, donde nosotros podamos intercambiar nuestras estrategias. Y esa es la idea un poco que surgió con el Febrero Azul. Otra vez, a ratos da un poco de, no sé, nos da un poco de rabia el hecho de que pareciera que siempre tenemos que estar organizándonos en relación a algo que se hace, ¿no? Como que al final de cuentas ellos nos convocan a organizarnos, pero como les digo, en estos espacios estamos tratando de hacer lo contrario. El movimiento por el agua ha estado, como Meera nos ha contado, ha estado históricamente organizado desde hace más de 20 años. Hay nuevas organizaciones, hay nuevas personas involucradas, algunos ya estamos de salida y hay otras personas nuevas entrando. Entonces creo que estamos peleando en todos estos ámbitos, en todas estas dimensiones y en todos estos espacios, ¿no? En los nuestros, en los de ellos y en los que vayan a surgir. Entonces esta es la idea un poco del Febrero Azul. Podemos ponerles en el chat más información sobre dónde encontrar más información sobre los eventos que se han hecho, que se están planificando y también para que de alguna manera podamos contactarnos entre nosotros, ¿no? De sumar nuevas organizaciones a estos esfuerzos. Gracias, Mar.
Thank you, Marcela, for providing an overview of Blue February and why it is necessary to democratize the discussion before the UN Water Conference. Next, I'm happy to introduce David Boyce, the General Secretary of Public Services International, a global federation of 700 labor unions representing 30 million workers in 160 countries. David is a recognized expert on water and energy, providing advice to union campaigns to resist privatization, to build alliances within society, and to strengthen public advocacy. He was a member of UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's Advisory Board on Water and Sanitation, where he steered the concept of public-public partnerships, leading to the creation of the Global Water Operators Partnerships Alliance. David, could you tell us more about the corporate capture of the UN Water Conference? How are corporations influencing it, and what are the dangers of this influence?
Thank you, Mary. And comrades, friends, welcome, and thanks to everybody who's worked hard to put this conference together. Now, let me get right to the point, and I will keep track of my time as well, so that what could be a small master's degree ends up being about 8 minutes. So who are the companies? First, the water supply companies. The biggest now is the French Veolia, It sounds like a cooking oil, but it's a water company that's had over 100 years of experience in running the water systems, not only in France, but around the world. They just finished a hostile and expensive takeover of most of its French rival Suez, which sounds like the Suez Canal, but is basically another water utility. Both of these companies have a multitude of subsidiaries, such as Aguas de Barcelona and others with many different names. And they are really like the spider in the web with a lot of influence in water policy. They have built their business model by getting close to governments, and they know how to do it. And they've got a lot of experience in providing service to governments, in former times in delivering bribes to governments and political parties. So these two companies are experts at doing what they do best, and they've managed to get into a whole range of the UN systems. They're close to many governments. They're quite close to the French government, historically have been, and close to many of the city governments. There's a couple of other companies that are trying to grow, and I don't think they're threatening the dominance of the French yet, but there's a company called Agea, A-G-E-A, in Brazil. There are Metro and Manila Water from the Philippines. There's not a lot of actual water supply and sanitation companies in the world. They have a lobby group called Aquafed, which is small but loud and spends its whole time making connections with various government entities. And Aquafed is particularly aggressive in trying to silence or delegitimize our opinions whenever they get into our various meetings. And another of the lobby groups already mentioned, Aquafed was mentioned, is the World Water Council based in Marseille, supported by the two main French companies, but also by the World Bank, and increasingly by other actors, some of them national governments, because the World Water Council actually did something quite smart in setting up the triennial World Water Forum that Meera talked about, where they actually tried to dominate the global political parameters of water and sanitation. So let's not forget sanitation, which is a hugely important and very expensive aspect of providing services, especially to urban populations, peri-urban. But you also have, Mary, some other actors. I'm not sure how big they are in this conference, but you've got some public providers that act like privateers outside their borders. You have Mekorot from Israel, which is going around the world selling its expertise at water conservation. But we've got to understand that Mekorot is also a policy tool of the Israeli state to limit access to water for Palestinian communities, which then makes it almost impossible for these communities to survive. You've got K-Water from Korea. You've got Singapore's PUB. These are public, built through public money at home, through public management at home, public control. But once they get outside of their borders, they act like privateers. And there's trying to be more and more of those. I know there was one in Uganda that was trying to do that too, with limited success. And now, as you well know, Mary, and as our colleagues on this call know, there's private equity, there's hedge funds, and there's other financial actors like Brookfields and like BlackRock and a whole range of financial companies who have nothing to do with water, but who now own water utilities in Chile, in the UK, in Brazil, and are expanding. There's also Macquarie Bank, and painfully from the labor movement side, there's a number of pension funds that manage the retirement assets of workers. But also at the conference are a plethora of water companies that deal with construction, with consulting, with engineering, supplies, both for water supply and sanitation, but also for dealing with the threats coming from the climate crisis, which most noteworthy are the Dutch, who are also co-organizing this conference. But the Dutch, 1,000-year capacity of keeping out the ocean, of dealing with floods, of building flood protection, building dikes. They are all across this conference, and I'm afraid their government is acting as one of their salesmen or their network agents. And so we'll see a fair amount of that, but odds are we won't even see most of it because they will network typically behind closed doors in meetings that they planned ahead, but possibly also in public events where there won't be much public speaking, but there might be fine wine, possibly some whiskey, and maybe some good bites to eat. But it's clear that the Dutch government is very much involved with these companies and their international mechanisms, whether it's the embassies or the trade bureaus or the donor structure is very focused on winning contracts for these companies. But I would say in closing, the biggest impact of the private sector in this conference was probably back in 2013, 14, and 15, leading up to the design of the Sustainable Development Goals, of which water and sanitation is goal number 6. And that is the heavy corporate influence that said to the UN and has been saying to national governments for years that there's not enough money in public or government coffers. And so in order to deliver water, health, education, transport, energy, we need to bring in private finance. We need innovative finance. We need blended finance. And I think if I were to have to call out our main, as it were, corporate actor in this conference, it would be that whole mix that says we just don't have enough money. And strangely enough, the water milieu, what I call the probably poorly, but the water mafia never talks about tax justice, never talks about the importance of debt relief. So I think we need to put those on the table too. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. The conference sounds almost like a trade show or corporate expo for various private interests. I found it especially outrageous when Adrian from the Blue Planet Project flagged that aqua-fed and water privatizers are speaking on a panel about water inequity and the human rights to water and sanitation. So next, we're joined by Dinesh Suna, the program executive and coordinator for the Ecumenical Water Network at the World Council of Churches. The Ecumenical Water Network is a platform of Christian churches and organizations committed to increasing access to safe drinking water and dignified sanitation worldwide. He's Lutheran and has worked with several ecumenical organizations in his home country of India since the 1990s, including the National Council of Churches of India, the Churches Auxiliary for Social Action, and Student Christian Movement of India. Currently, he's one of the co-leads of the Partnership of Religious and Sustainable Development Workstream on Environment, Water, and Climate Action. Dinesh, you've been working in and with the United Nations for years. Given the numerous concerns that the water justice movement has about corporate influence in this space, can you tell us more about that relationship with the water justice movement, like Meera talked about, to the United Nations, but also why the United Nations still remains relevant and important for us and the water justice movement to engage in?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary. And At the outset, my apologies. I'm a little under the weather, having a bad flu. So I hope I'll be able to make my points across clearly. And first of all, I'm not sure if all of the participants are able to see how many of us have joined in this webinar. I could see more than 104 participants are here, which is quite interesting, very exciting. And thank you so much for encouraging one another through this initiative. So as Mary introduced, I'm based here in Geneva at the World Council of Churches, coordinating a program called the Ecumenical Water Network. And that gives an advantage to liaise with several UN mechanisms that are based here in Geneva, and particularly to emphasize the work with the UN OHCHR, of which I'm so happy to see Pedro Arrojo, our Special Rapporteur for Human Right to Water Sanitation, joining us here. And so we have had the opportunity to very first demanding the creation of a special rapporteur. As we know that even though in 2010 we had the recognition of human right to water and sanitation was recognized and ratified at the Human Rights Council subsequently, but we have had in the past, to start with, an independent expert that was in the form of in the name of Katerina Albuquerque. And then we demanded, along with several other civil society groups as well, to have a special rapporteur and not just an independent expert. And subsequently, Katerina was next time promoted as the special rapporteur, and subsequently Leo Heller, and now dear Pedro Arroyo holding this important position. And as civil society representative, particularly from the faith-based groups, we have been able to liaise and contribute. Some of you must have also seen or read the publication On the Right Track, some of the good practices on realizing human right to water and sanitation. We've been able to mobilize contributions there, and time to time respond to various calls and appeals sent by the Special Rapporteur's Office. Friends, one thing I would like to underline here is that several other speakers have said this before us. Unfortunately, we do not at the moment have a UN intergovernmental mechanism to address the water justice issues. We do have the UNFCCC to address the issues of climate change, where the governments come together every year and then they talk and come upon some agreement and then implement. However, when it comes to water issues, we do not have such a mechanism, and that's how we give rise to, that has given rise to several actors that David just mentioned, the World Water Council in Marseille or the Stockholm International Water Institute. They keep organizing this triennial World Water Forum or the annual World Water Week in Stockholm, just to give you a taste of how expensive it is for people to participate. A registration fees of €1,000 for 5 days, and with hotels and flights, it's almost €5,000 for one person to attend the World Water Forum. And if you want to host a side event, you have to pay another €5,000. So roughly about €10,000 for one entity to organize one event and one person's participation. So how fair is that, and how an average grassroots water justice representative would be able to participate in these platforms? And that is where it is overtly dominated by the corporates who have the money, and they see this as a investment and with high return, and therefore they put lots of money into these events and reap the so-called benefits. There is another effort also, I would say, that I remember some of you did participate, including myself, the 7th World Water Forum in Daegu. And that's where, when Meera was mentioning how the water justice movement was protesting against the World Water Forum, and at the same venue and promoting an alternative World Water Forum. But then the organizers also, they saw this one, and finally they started co-opting the civil society organizations into the World Water Forum processes. And in Daegu, they completely provided another venue altogether in South Korea for the 7th World Water Forum, and paid for every civil society organization's participation with flight, accommodation, everything. So this was a very smooth operation of co-opting the civil society organizations and show that we are all balanced. Also, we are seeing the butterfly effect. There's another coalition of civil society organizations. From the face value, that would seem like a very good initiative to involve the civil societies, but then there is some sort of hand-in-glove operations going on there as well with the corporates and the civil societies. So we need to be wary of these alliances that are happening around us. And that is where I think it is all the more important that the UN is still our best bet. Despite its limitations that we may still have against about the UN mechanisms, this is still our best bet, wherein we do not have to spend thousands of dollars to go and participate in some of these activities. Or if Pedro was once giving an example, if we would ask the vaccine companies to decide about the health policies and not the WHO, then what would be the fate of the people? And similarly, if the UN would not come up with an intergovernmental mechanism to address the issue of water justice, the World Water Council or the CV and the likes would continue to plunder the opportunities they see in the so-called blue gold. I also saw the interesting coalition that is happening between the climate and water. In the last, the COP27, I was there in Egypt, and there was a special day dedicated to water. And the president of the UN General Assembly, Kasba Krosoi, he made a mention that this is the water COP. COP27 is a water COP because, of course, Egypt has so much relevance to water, but this kind of various UN mechanisms are now taking up water on its fold. And after almost 50 years now that we are going to have the first ever conference of water called by the UN at this magnitude, and therefore it is a very big opportunity for us to mobilize ourselves and come together to work for water justice for all. And I am sure with all of our collective effort, we would still be able to make a dent, even though a lot of the processes are still off limit for the civil society. And nevertheless, we must continue to try. So thank you very much. I stop here. I think my time is up.
Thank you, Dinesh. I hope you feel better soon. And thank you also for pointing out that the very lack of an intergovernmental mechanism to address water justice issues creates a space for private corporations to dominate water forums and even co-opt civil society spaces. And this is why the UN remains important to create a more accessible space. And so to round out our panel discussion and talk more about the solutions that we could advance in the UN space, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Strat. She is a policymaker, consultant, and lecturer. As a former deputy mayor of Paris, she successfully led the remunicipalization of the Parisian Water Department, creating a single public water operator, and yielded a new water policy in Paris that focused on economic, social, environmental, and democratic sustainability. In 2008, she co-founded and chaired Aqua Publica Europe, a network of European publicly owned water and sanitation operators. She is currently a senior consultant for the Global Water Operators Partnerships Alliance at UN Habitat. And would you please describe the Global Water Operators Partnerships Alliance and talk about how we can advance public sector solutions at the UN? How can we use this space to help promote public-public and public-community partnerships and help communities regain and strengthen public water management?
Hello, thank you, Mary, and thank you for organizing this webinar and for inviting me. So just to try to reply quite quickly, the UN Secretary General Advisory Board on Water and Sanitation, UNSGAB, and David Boyes knows very well the history of UNSGAB, requested UN Habitat to establish a global mechanism to promote non-for-profit peer support partnerships between water utilities. So Global Water Operators Partnership Alliance, GWOPA, was launched in 2009 and is a network of partners, mainly operators, but also civil society, NGOs, trade unions, and committed to helping water operators improve their capacity in providing access to water and sanitation services for all through water operators partnerships. So what is this WOP? How does it work? So as I said, is a solidarity-based support, a peer-to-peer partnership, not to be used for commercial purposes. And the main goal is to share best practices and knowledge between operators. So we have a mentee, utility partner with an identified capacity need, and a utility partner, mentor, willing and able to help it. So the partnerships can also involve more than two sanitation and water services. So the WOP aims to be demand-driven. So it's very important. A mentor and mentee are equally important actors. Both define the framework of the partnerships, unlike other more traditional top-down solidarity projects. The agreements to establish WOPs are result-oriented and based on peer-to-peer and exchanges and mutual trust and good governance. WOPs can be used in a range of settings, from urban to small towns and from middle-income countries to low-income states. So why it's important to participate from the GWOPA perspective, of course, why it's important to participate in the UN Water Conference. As many of us experiences, we saw that accreditation process for the UN Water Conference was very challenging and above all unfair for public utilities and local authorities. Public sector could not get accredited to this conference because the specific UN categories to become accredited include private sector and not public sector. So being there, it's a way to say we, public sector, public utilities, local operators, we exist, and you UN system, you have to count on us. And the GWOPA network is working on many events, special events, side events, and many initiatives, and we are very mobilized. And our main goals are to showcase best practices and know-how of public utilities in achieving human rights to water and sanitation and SDGs, to show we can provide lessons learned from the field, give visibility to local operators, and raise utilities voices. As Meera said, water issues are very local, and we need to use this conference to convince that local operators are the true game changers, to use the UN words. So utilities are key actors and play a crucial role for providing access to wash services and to the population, and their role must be recognized. So it's very important, as I insist, to be there, to participate in side events, in networking, in initiatives, and to get visibility. So the key, just to have time for the Q&A. So very quickly, some key messages we want to raise. Facing the big challenges like population growth, climate change, loss of biodiversity, increased water scarcity, we can improve access to clean water and sanitation for all by significantly stepping up our efforts to ensure urban and rural water supplies are managed sustainability with a public and democratic management. So it's one of the key messages, public and democratic management by utilities. And public services are operational actors on the ground to achieve SDGs at the local level. So their participation in decision at the international level on how to address water challenges is needed. Based on the insight that most of the required resources of skills needed for solid and sound utility and management reside with utility staff, WOPs are a very, very useful tool and help transfer this capacity through partnerships, twinning and networking between water operators at local, regional, and national levels. And the last one, utilities are not sufficiently empowered to meet the demands placed upon them, and there is a need to scale up proven mechanisms to strengthen their institutional capacity to deliver better and more sustainable services. Models such as WOPs, Water Operators Partnership, should have appropriate anchoring in the UN system. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Around the world, the vast majority of people receive their water service from public providers. There is substantial knowledge in the public sector. So we are grateful that you are helping organize events to share that knowledge and those best practices. So now we will take some questions from the audience. I think we have one for Pedro. How can we ensure that popular organizations have the same space as private sector representatives at the UN meetings? This comes from Edson, from the National Observatory for the Rights to Water and Sanitation in Brazil.
Well, we have no the guarantee that we need because is UNDESA who decides the speakers and nearly everything. In the special event, especially in the dialogue, in the sessions, the plenary sessions, and interactive dialogues. So in this is just UNDESA who decides, in principle, not just the key speakers, but also the way of asking for the floor, for instance. In general, in the UN protocols, in general, is the priority is for the states. So if you have 80 member states that ask for the floor, finished. We have no more time for people. So say it's absurd, but it's in this way. We are trying, pressing for changing this protocol in this case, because it's necessary that the countries, that the governments, instead of talking for saying nothing normally, the most important is that they need to listen what the people have to say then. You know? But I don't know if we will get any change at this respect. In the special events, it is theoretically is the movements or the society, the social movements who are in charge of organizing. But the ones who are have lobby capacity inside the UN are the ones who have taken more or less the space for having these commissions, organizing commissions in each one of the 4 special events. For instance, my office or my mandate is involved in the one who has the main topic is human rights. At least one space is on human rights. Well, in this space, Aquafed has taken kind of leadership is absurd. That doesn't make sense. So I had, together with the indigenous people at the beginning, we had confrontation, direct confrontation, but I don't know what will be the result. We are asking for concrete proposals for speakers in the space, but we will see. And I'm not sure at all that it will be a space that will need some kind of reaction from the movements. No, I have said, if you don't want to have around human rights, the private kind of space. If so, movements will be, and it will not be my decision, it will not be my action. People will protest for this question, the same as people and the movements organize the Alternative Water Forum every day, every time we have the Global Water Forum, because the people don't rely on the private sector for talking about rights. So we proposed concretely to this commission, the organizing commission, and the special event number 3, put in the key organizing committee people's work. It is evident to have someone inside for discussing and for preparing the event. I'm not sure if finally they will reject it, but it was not on the consensus, because the Aquafed, together with the two satellites they have introduced in this commission, there's a Youth Parliament for Africa, I don't know what, and Women for Water, or something like this, together with the private sector. Don't agree with this, so there is no consensus necessary to have consensus on all the proposals. So I don't know. We don't have the capacity of guaranteeing these questions you said. So of course we have the capacity of rejecting something or some event or some space, or of course to have our own spaces, or to participate in these different spaces for giving our opinion, position, or even rejection, of course. So I don't know what will be the final result. I'm trying to press at all the levels, asking for meeting with, I have for the moment a meeting with the High Commissioner in some days. I am asking also with Antonio Guterres, and another one with the President of the General Assembly for explaining these kind of things. I am talking also with the organizers, political organizers, that means with Henkovink, and they say, well, I really understand, but it's UNDESA who is in charge of this kind of decisions. So I don't know.
Mary, I think you're on mute still.
Oh, sorry. Well, thank you for letting me know. And we'll come back to this question shortly. But before we do, let's have a question for David before he leaves. There's a question for you. Is there any mapping of organizations, corporations, NGOs, and clusters that do pseudo-advocacy for water and sanitation, but are hiding behind corporate or economic interests? Who is part of this water mafia?
Thanks, Mary. And as I wrote in the answer, the mapping is crucial, not only of the companies, and that whole range of companies, as I indicated, is expanding into actors that we don't typically know about, but also when the World Bank comes in with a project conditioning on privatization, or the regional banks, the African or the Inter-American Development Bank, et cetera, and bilateral aid agencies pushing privatizations for their national companies. And as I drafted briefly, this requires a lot of research. It requires coordination to constantly update. We need more academics in every region of the globe to look into these things. We've got a fair amount of studies, but we need more, and things are changing. The other thing I would mention, just as I literally have to run out the door, be careful of the privateers, and I say privateers writ large, co-opting our language. Not only our people, I mean, none of the water justice movement, but some NGOs that were mentioned before, but co-opting our language of sustainability in climate, of just transition, and human rights. I mean, again, I'm not sure if it's totally clear, but this conference is not a policy negotiation conference. It's one to assess the progress towards the 2030 agenda in water. And the UN desperately wants commitments of all the actors who will say they'll do things. And I think we need to be very clear that we will continue to shine the light on the misguided problems, that we will focus on public finance, on support to the subnational public utilities that typically don't have a voice in the UN. Thanks very much, Mary, and thanks to all the comments on this call. Over.
Thank you, David. And now I want to return to that other question, because it seems to be the heart of what we're trying to talk about today, how to ensure that popular organizations have space as private sector. So Meera, I want to turn this to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. I mean, I should preface this by saying, I think two of the most important opportunities we've had, like historically at the UN, one was when someone from the movements and from the alternative forum, Pablo Salón, who eventually then became an official voice for the Bolivian government, became an ambassador at the UN, right? And so then we were able to get the human right to water and sanitation. Until then, all the institutions, the UN agencies working on that were kind of dragging their feet, and it wasn't moving forward. And it took Pablo coming in and pushing it and making it happen. But he also came from, initially from our spaces, from our movements. And then the second is with Pedro being, and before Pedro, Leo Heller. So we've had two special rapporteurs who come from social movements and who have brought our voices into those spaces. And I think I want to just highlight that is such an important thing, having you, Pedro, and the work that you've done to create space for us in the preparatory meetings. That is tremendously valuable. However, the way the UN kind of categorizes consultations as well, because so yes, the intergovernmental spaces, the only way for us to have an impact is to lobby governments. And this is what we've done in the past, is we've, tried to get governments on board, and it's an imperfect process where we give them language and what they say on the floor is slightly different. And so we don't have a lot of influence, but that's what we've done in the past, where we've mapped out which governments we should lobby and which governments can go forward with our messages. That's worked to varying degrees. And the other thing has been what they call the stakeholder consultation. So there are different mechanisms for this. And at the SDGs, we worked through what they call the major groups, which were set up for the UN environmental conferences. And so, there's youth, and there's unions, workers, there's women, there's NGOs. Now, the problem also with how the UN defines civil society is that, and I think this is where the distinction we've been making about human rights holders versus stakeholders is really, really important, because those spaces get dominated, as Pedro said, with those who have the most resources to make the most noise, right? So Aquafed is a nonprofit. That's how they're a civil society organization. So they don't talk about the fact that they're actually representing industry in the private sector. They consider themselves a nonprofit because as an entity, they're an advocacy group. And so all these lobby groups have a much bigger voice than grassroots organizations. And this is where, there's an extent to which we can't discount the value that we've had disrupting. At the World Water Forum, we were able to disrupt. We were able to, build our movement by being disruptive. And so there's an extent to which, yes, we should find ways to collaborate and to be officially involved, but, we should also figure out ways to, strengthen our movements and create our own spaces, but also, disrupt and hold governments accountable and call them out when they are not.
Thank you, Meera. And now I want to turn this question to Anne too for a response.
Okay, unmute. Yes, just to follow what Meera said, and also to reply to some question raised in the Q&A. I think, okay, it's very important to try by all the ways we can to try to influence the UN Water Conference. It's true that, as David said, there is no, there won't be state commitments, so no very strong policies, you know, will be, yes, will be resulted from this conference. But we have the Water Action Agenda. So the Water Action Agenda is not very well known from the civil society, NGOs, activists, and even public utilities operators. That is very important. It's open to everyone, even if you are not accredited, and if you cannot attend the UN Water Conference, you can register a commitment, an initiative, a project, any inputs in this Water Action Agenda. And I know that because I attended many meetings hosted by Tajikistan and Netherlands, you know, the co-host of the UN Water Conference. For the organizer, the Water Action Agenda is a very important tool for them, because they already know that there won't be any very tangible and concrete result coming out from the UN Water Conference. But the Water Action Agenda, if we have a lot of messages, project, I repeat, a commitment and blah, blah, you know, focusing on human rights to water and sanitation, public management, democratic management, public participation, and so on, we can, of course, it's not, it won't be a revolution, but we can influence. So I think we need to use this tool to be more vocal on our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And I want to remind everyone that if you have a question for our panelists, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So I'm going to turn this back to Pedro for a response.
Sí, una cuestión que creo es importante. En general, esta gran coalición que representa People's Water Forum, por la cual os doy a todos la enhorabuena entusiástica, está centrada en torno a los movimientos que rechazan los procesos y las estrategias de privatización y de financiarización del agua y de los servicios de agua y saneamiento. Me parece estratégico hacer una alianza con los movimientos que desde la perspectiva ecologista o desde el mundo de los pueblos indígenas reivindican lo que yo digo, hacer las paces con la naturaleza. Reivindican la lucha por recuperar el buen estado ecológico de nuestros ecosistemas. Hay una forma previa a las estrategias de privatización con las que solemos discutir, una estrategia previa de apropiación y de privatización del agua, que ha sido justamente a través de las funciones públicas del Estado, que ha sido quien generalmente, por ejemplo, ha financiado con dinero público las grandes obras hidráulicas, las grandes presas, los grandes trasvases, las grandes instalaciones hidráulicas, pero bajo el control indirecto o directo a veces de los intereses privados, ya fueran los intereses hidroeléctricos, ya fueran los intereses de agroproducción industrial, de agroexportación, etcétera, etcétera. Y ese tipo de dinámica agresiva, de dominación de la naturaleza, es una forma de apropiación destructiva que rompe también al final el acceso al agua potable y al saneamiento, lo sabemos todos. Yo, de hecho, este año uno de mis informes temáticos ante el Consejo de Derechos Humanos es este desafío, el desafío de hacer las paces con la naturaleza, la confluencia del derecho humano al agua y al saneamiento con la confluencia con el derecho humano a un buen estado de los ecosistemas acuáticos, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que ahí la alianza con los pueblos indígenas es absolutamente fundamental, lo que nos ha explicado Dario Mejías, o lo que yo estoy intentando también, que entren y están en una actividad intensa para venir a Nueva York, por ejemplo, International Rivers, ¿no? Que protagonizaron y han protagonizado la lucha de los pueblos afectados por grandes represas, ¿no? Y que defienden los ríos como ecosistemas acuáticos que debemos recuperar para todos, y no para los intereses económicos más poderosos, ¿no? La presencia del movimiento ecologista a veces todavía hemos conseguido que sea todavía insuficientemente fuerte y tenemos que fortalecer esa alianza en torno a People's Water Forum. Desde mi punto de vista es muy, muy importante. Y por último, yo no desdeñaría, me parece muy importante ganar en esta alianza también al máximo de ONGs que, teniendo unas perspectivas más institucionalistas, unas estrategias de trabajo y de lucha más institucionalistas, sin embargo, comparten en lo fundamental también la lucha contra la preponderancia del interés privado, la preponderancia de hacer del agua un negocio. Y yo creo que ahí People's Water Forum puede ejercer también una atracción, de manera que se haga una gran coalición imposible de ser aislada y con una perspectiva de dominancia, incluso de tener una visibilidad muy grande en esta conferencia y de cara al futuro en Naciones Unidas. Gracias.
Thank you, Pedro. And I want to go to Madeline. She had a question about how it is best to intervene and participate in the conference, and what will Bolivia or other countries be doing at the conference. Marcela, I saw you put a response in the chat box. Would you say it out loud as well?
Yeah, I was. I'm sure the government, not just the Bolivian government, but other governments will be bringing a different perspective, and that's very important. It's very important to show and to talk about and name these different perspectives and demonstrate that it's possible to think and see these things in other way. That is not what the dominant discourse that they put it on this conference and by these big institutions. It is important, but our role, I feel like, social movements and organizations that we're working locally in our countries, it's important to also make sure that those perspectives and those speeches there are being put in place in our own countries. Otherwise, they're just words. It's empty. It doesn't help. So I believe that, yes, we make them, we need those different perspectives there, but we also have to make sure that locally, they are doing what they are talking there. I find it that crucial. Otherwise, we're just working with words and not actions. And at this point, we need actions.
Thank you, Marcela. I agree. It's time for action. There's another question in the chat box about compromises that are done in the name of negotiation at international conferences like the Conference of Parties. Dinesh, would you be able to answer that one?
Yes, sure. I just also wrote to the person who had asked, I think Angelius. That's a valid point, but of course, negotiations is all about compromises between parties. But my concern, as I have been also reiterating the fact that we do have this conference of parties for various aspects on climate change. We have got for oceans, we've got for biodiversity. We do not have one yet on water, and that is what I have been trying to emphasize, is that if we do not have any such mechanisms, then it's all for the private entities and the corporates to plunder and have their own shows and in their own terms. And that is why, even though with all its, no system today, including the UN, is all foolproof, but at least we would have some level of participation and trust between the civil society and any such UN mechanisms. It would still be better than a privately run, a corporation-run entities. And that's why, even though the Conference of Parties would have compromises, but still it is somewhat accessible than the current modus operandi. So I think we should, I do not know if the UN conference would, under the action agenda, would think in this line, but it's for us to wait and watch what would be the outcome of this 1 in 50 years sort of a conference. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think just maybe as our final question, asking about, someone put in a question asking about how civil society is losing faith and hope in the processes, that results are just invisible. So maybe could people speak to what is coming that is new? What are the opportunities? Where can hope be found in these processes? Would anyone like to take that question? Meera, yes.
I mean, I think, consistently, like I said, one, we have an opportunity. And so I'm hopeful. And I think most of us put some faith into this process because, and not to put too much pressure on you, Pedro, but having a special rapporteur who is engaged in our spaces, who's having conversations with us and taking that back to the UN. I mean, that's where faith in that space happens, I think, or where there's some hope in that space. It's also why we've put some faith into this process. At the same time, we can't let, this is the first UN Water Forum in more than 40 years, and so we can't let our governments, we can't let the UN off the hook. We need to be there to voice our concerns and make our demands. At the same time, I think for me, faith is always going to be in what happens outside of those spaces, or hope is going to come from what happens outside those spaces. And I think the building of Blue February and the People's Water Forum, as Pedro mentioned, that to me is, I put a lot of faith and I have a lot of hope in that process, because where we can build our movement and support our local struggles, I think we're going to have the most impact.
Thank you, Meera. Marcela, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I was thinking on that notion of hope that has Rebecca Solnit when she says, hope is not the certainty that everything is going to be fine, but it's more like the possibilities that we are creating, right? So I feel like in the water movement, we have been creating these possibilities and alternatives. And while we do that, like when Meera was talking about disrupting spaces, we also had fun with that, despite the heaviness or some serious issues that are at stake there, we have had fun, like organizing ourselves and doing things, because I feel like it's important also to feel joy, to have fun and to enjoy ourselves, because nobody's going to join a movement that is boring or that it's sad. We have done these things with a lot of faith, a lot of hope, and also we had fun like doing that. So I feel I want to recover these notions that we sometimes forget because the issues are serious, and we think we cannot laugh while we organize, and we have done that. So I want to, bring back these concepts and these feelings while we do the things that we're doing right now.
Thank you, Marcela. We need to have fun too while we organize. So I want to turn it to Pedro too for a response.
No, just one to say to let you know that it seems to be that General Assembly could have or could prepare for the end of the year kind of resolution about the issues that will be on water and sanitation in general. So it's not clear at all, but it seems to be that is possible. So in any case, I think it's very important what Marcela was saying is I think we need to talk with each one in their countries with their own government because finally United Nations are the governments. So we need to have pressure on our own governments and also to have a specific relationship with the governments that are more open to dialoguing, to have our feelings, our positions. And in Latin America, there are several, Spain, Germany, and others, without any doubt. So for me, it's very important to have this strategy also of having an alliance strategy with governments also. And the other front in which is so important to work also, and in this case, I think is not strong enough, the presence is the municipalities, the local governments is so important. So Europa for me is very important, but also because, well, in this case, the participation in New York of the municipalities and the operators, the public operators, have been very strongly restricted because of the bureaucracy of the UN, you know. But looking at the future is very important to have Acqua Pubblica Europea and all the networks with all the municipal and local governments and operators. And finally, I think the last front in which I think is important to strengthen, to make a stronger relationship is the community-based management in rural communities, acueductos comunitarios in Latin America, and the beginning of this kind of approach also and organization in Africa, I think is so important. I begin to know this huge world, you know, but for me it's very important for us in general to make a stronger this relationship. Governments, local governments and operators, and community-based institutions.
Thank you, Pedro. And it's exciting to hear that a resolution may be coming by the end of the year. And I appreciate how you brought it back to how the origins of the water justice movement happened at the local level with local struggles around water access. So that is an important note that we are still winning at the local level in many places, and we can have hope and faith in our successes locally. Water is such a local issue for many people. So that was our final question, and this concludes our webinar. So thank you again to our wonderful speakers and to our audience for joining us today. Please join the People's Water Forum for the next 2 webinars in this series. Next week, on February 28th, the People's Water Forum is hosting a webinar entitled Privatization of Water and Sanitation Services. What are the risks for human rights? Then on March 3rd, the final webinar will be Public and Community Partnerships, Community Participation to Guarantee the Rights to Water and Sanitation. For more on Blue February and these collective actions, you can visit thepeopleswaterforum.org, thepeopleswaterforum.org. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So nice to meet you, at least through the screen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for facilitating, Mary.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.